In perfect competition, entry will eventually drive profit to zero. If firms in an industry are making a profit, that means that they're making more in that industry than they could elsewhere, and other firms outside of that industry are going to want to enter. As they enter, they raise supply, and that through our normal supply and demand analysis will lower price, which will lower profit. The only way for people to earn a persistent profit in an industry is for there to be a barrier to entry. There has to be things that stop other people from entering your industry and eating some of your profits. This video, we're going to talk about 6 barriers to entry. Now, the best barriers to entry are the ones erected by the government, because if the government says you can't enter this industry and you try to, well, the government can throw you in jail. If you want to practice law in the United States, you've got to go to regular college for 4 years, then you've got to go to law school for 3 years, and then you've got to take a bar exam. And the bar exam is tough enough that even a bunch of people who go to the best law schools fail it. And this is all to get the government's permission to practice law. Now, why does the government make it so difficult to become a lawyer? Well, one argument that lawyers would probably give is, well, we need to have really high standards for lawyers, so that's why we have to make sure the government only allows people to become lawyers if they've gone through this enormous amount of training and they've proven themselves on a bar exam. The problem with this theory is that the bar exam tends to test things that don't come up very often in the practice of most lawyers' jobs. A more likely explanation is that lawyers want to reduce entry into their profession. So what they do is they get the state to make it difficult for people to become lawyers, and this keeps the wages of lawyers high. So you can imagine the people who care the most about who can become a lawyer are existing lawyers and people who will soon want to enter the legal profession. But there's going to be a lot more existing lawyers who benefit from very high barriers to entry to the legal profession than there are people who are about to enter the legal profession. So the existing lawyers make sure the barriers to entry are very high. This keeps wages very high. People who want to become lawyers, they have to suffer and go pass the bar exam, go to school for all this time, but once they do become lawyers, then they're better off. A lot of other professions have occupational licenses. To be a plumber or electrician in many states, you've got to pass an exam, or you might have to take a certain number of courses. You can always justify this in terms of, well, we need to make sure there's high standards, but this also has the effect of making it more costly to enter the profession. This reduces the supply of people in the profession, and therefore it keeps wages high. So let's imagine that some state makes it difficult to become an electrician, and they actually do a good job. Only the people who are very smart become electricians. You might think this is important to save lives because, if you do bad electrical work, you'll kill yourself or you'll kill your clients. However, if we have a high price of hiring an electrician, more people will do electrical work on their own rather than hiring a professional, and that could end up killing more people than if we had lower standards for professional electricians. But in other states, you actually need a license to be a flower arranger, or you need a license to be an interior decorator, or to cut someone's hair. The basic reason is that people in a profession want to stop there from being entry. So they organize, they get together in professional associations and they lobby their state government or they lobby national government, say, hey, make it difficult to enter our profession and justify what you're saying to voters, justify these rules to voters by saying we're doing it to keep standards high. An unfortunate consequence of this, though, is that it's more expensive to hire people in these professions, and it's harder to get jobs in these professions. But occupational licenses are a very big deal in the United States. They're responsible for a lot of people making higher wages than they otherwise would, and for a lot of people not having jobs in professions who otherwise would, and they're responsible for consumers paying a lot more money than they otherwise would. Unions can also be a source of a barrier to entry. Let's imagine that the workers in an industry are making pretty good wages. They're making a profit compared to what they could make if they worked in some other industry where they would be doing, work of about as equal skill and about as unpleasant. Now, natural response of this would be employers would say, okay, well, we'll hire more people and this will drive down wages. But the workers in this industry, if they're well organized will say, let's not let that happen. We'll form a union and we'll say you're only allowed to work in this industry if you join the union. And we'll restrict who can join the union. By restricting who can join the union, we'll lower the supply of laborers in this industry, and that'll keep up wages. If one of the companies attempts to hire people who aren't in our union, we'll go on strike against them. We'll picket their workplaces. We might engage in low-level violence. We'll try to yell at the people who are trying to work for this company. Maybe if we can, we'll get friendly politicians to support us. So unions, if they're successful, can keep down the supply of labor in an industry, and it can keep up wages. And having to join a union is a big barrier to entry to entering some professions. Although in the United States, unions seem to be steadily declining in power, at least in the private sector. In the public sector, they can be very important. Another huge barrier to entry is control of a vital resource. OPEC, which stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is a group of countries, including Saudi Arabia, that have a huge amount of oil. And they got together and they said, let's work together to maintain a really high price of oil. Specifically, Saudi Arabia said, we won't pump as much oil as we otherwise would, so we can keep the quantity supply of oil relatively low, and this will raise the price. And a lot of countries that have a lot of oil have done this, and they've tried to work together to maintain a high price of oil. Because you need to have a lot of oil in order to sell oil, in order to be a big player in the oil market, having access to oil wells acts as an excellent barrier to entry. The South African diamond cartel, Du Bois, I always mispronounce it, they've also done a good job of maintaining a barrier to entry. Diamonds actually, earth-made diamonds are not really a rare resource. There's a lot of diamonds, but the South Africa-controlled cartel buys up a lot of the raw diamonds, and then they only sell a small number of them to jewelers. This causes the price of diamonds to be much higher than it otherwise is. Now, the few countries that have lots of earth-made diamonds, they're very happy to play along because they know that if not for this cartel, the price of diamonds would be very, very low. So the Du Bois cartel has been one of the most successful cartels because it's managed to persuade all of the people who have access to lots of earth-made diamonds to play along, and they've all become much richer because of this. And of course, another result is people pay a heck of a lot more for diamond jewelry than they otherwise would, because the people who control diamonds have used this control as a barrier to entry into the diamond market. Incompatibility serves as another big barrier to entry. So imagine that I want to make a cell phone, and I want to compete with the iPhone. Well, one of the problems for me competing with the iPhone is that a big reason people buy the iPhone is because of all the apps they can get with it. And all those apps would be incompatible with my iPhone. So when someone sells a product and there's a lot of good compliments for that product, if those compliments would be incompatible with a new product, then this incompatibility serves as a barrier to entry. Incompatibility played a huge role in Microsoft being so successful. Microsoft, make the Windows operating system, and there was a lot of software that just worked really well with that. So if someone wanted to compete with Microsoft by selling their own operating system, they'd face this barrier in that all the software would be incompatible with this new operating system. So when you have strong complements and incompatibility, that creates a huge barrier to entry to new people wishing to enter a market. Economies of scale are another barrier to entry. When there's economies of scale, it means it's very expensive to operate on a small scale, but your cost per customer goes down as you reach more and more customers. So one example is with landline telephones. It would be very expensive for someone to start a company where they just connected up telephone poles and wires to like 1,000 homes in a city, because it's much cheaper per customer to hook up the entire city. It can be the same with connecting everyone in a city to electricity or to water. So again, when there's economies of scale, that means on average, it's very expensive to serve just a few customers. It's much cheaper on average to serve lots of customers. So if someone is already selling electricity to everyone in a city, it's very tough to enter that market, because if you only sell electricity to a small number of people, your costs per customer are going to be enormous. So you really either have to enter in a big way or not at all. And the fact that you can't just sort of enter slowly, that really makes it more difficult to enter the market. Now, sometimes technology can defeat economies of scale. There are far more economies of scale with landline telephones than there are with cell phones. And the cell phone market really, destroyed AT&T's landline phone monopoly. The final barrier to entry I want to talk about today is another government-created barrier, and it's intellectual property, specifically patents and copyrights. If someone in the United States writes a book, they can get a copyright on that book, and no one else has the right to sell that book unless they get the permission of the copyright holder. Now, this is vital to create an incentive for people to make books for profit, because if you spend 5,000 hours making a book, and then anyone could freely copy it, well, you wouldn't be able to profit off the creation of your book. There's also, you can get copyrights on movies and music as well. So if you make a movie or make music, copyright law is what prevents other people from selling copies of that without your permission. And this barrier to entry creates incentives for people to create the original work. You can also get an intellectual property protection on ideas for products, and these are called patents. If you come up with an idea for a more fuel-efficient refrigerator, or for a car that goes faster, or better windshield wipers or something, you can apply to a patent office, and they'll, for a period of time, say only you have the right to sell inventions that use this particular idea. And if other people want to sell it, they've got to get your permission or pay you money. This creates an incentive for people to develop new ideas. It also applies for drugs, for the pharmaceutical industry. If you come up with a better combination of chemicals for treating heart disease, you can get a patent on that, and people can only make that drug if they get your permission. So intellectual property is a government-granted monopoly on ideas, and it creates a lot of incentives for people to develop the ideas. Of course, it also creates higher prices, because if anyone has the right to sell my book and they don't have to worry about paying me anything, they can sell it for pretty much the cost of making new copies. If drug companies come up with better heart medication, and they charge $5,000 a year for the treatment. Well, if the drug might cost $5 a year to make, and if it wasn't for the intellectual property protection, the drug would be a lot cheaper. So there's a trade-off with intellectual property. When you have strong protection for intellectual property, you get a lot more intellectual property created. We've got more pharmaceuticals, more movies, more books, more inventions. But those things, once they're created, are going to be more expensive, and so not as many people will have access to them. So getting the right level of intellectual property, to maximize the benefit to an economy, that's a tough thing to do. Thank you for listening to me today.